Thank you for joining us today, and we are glad that you are taking time out of your day to view this one-hour webinar. My name is Dave Helge, Vice President of Maintenance and Safety for Idealease. Idealease is committed to providing our customers and potential customers with safety and compliance information to assist you in enhancing your safety and loss control program. Due to the pandemic, we have canceled our on-site safety seminars in 2020 to protect the safety and health of our employees and you, our customer. In lieu of the seminars, we will be presenting 6 one-hour webinars over the next 3 months. Today's webinar is the second of the series. The topic for today is qualifying a driver for a commercial motor vehicle. Today we will follow the qualification process, starting with the driver selection through placing the driver in the unit for the first time. Enjoy the webinar.
Today we will be looking at driver qualifications and qualifying a driver. To me, this is a critical piece of driver hiring and qualification, is the background investigations, doing all that important work to make sure that you're making the best hire that you can. In today's world, there's not a safety director out there that hasn't hired a driver that they wish they wouldn't have. And so today we're going to talk about all the regulations as well as the information that is available to you today to make the best qualified hire and selection. So to get started, before we even get into selecting a driver, we need to talk about driver selection requirements. This is an important piece as well, as you and your insurance company and need to sit down and determine what are your minimum qualifications that you're going to hire a driver at. I tell folks that it has to be at least as stringent as the FMCSA or DOT at 21 years of age for interstate training or experience in equipment driven, not disqualified under 391 or 383, physically qualified under Part 391. However, in today's environment, you have to go above and beyond the federal regulations when hiring drivers to protect your liability. So insurance companies play an integral part in this, in that they determine, how much experience a driver is required to have for you to hire that driver. So 23 years of age, 2 years of verifiable experience, those are pretty common in today's hiring environment. However, with all that said, we're in a hiring shortage. We're in a driver shortage. The average age of a driver today is 52 years of age. And so we're seeing more of our experienced senior drivers leaving the industry. I tell people there's a study out there in 1980. They took a survey, and if you were between the ages of 21 and 24 in 1980, 95% of those people in that age group back then had a license. So we fast forward to like 2018, I think the study was done, and same age group, 21 to 24, that percentage is now at 75%. So we see a lot of our younger folks today in society not interested in driving anything, let alone a truck. and they're able to facilitate their social interaction and entertainment and all that through social media, as well as Uber, Lyft, all of those type of services now to get around. So in the future, and right now, I guess not in the future, right now, drivers are hard to come by. So, but we just can't go out and hire a driver, a warm body in the truck, because we've got liability exposure. We need to make sure we're putting the best qualified driver in the truck. Right now, today, the FMCSA has a regulation in place. It's been in place for a long time, a number of years, and it's CFR Part 380, Subpart E. This is a required entry-level driver training regulation. A lot of carriers don't even pay any attention to this regulation, or most of them don't even know it's in existence, because to be required to comply with this regulation, you have to qualify a driver with less than 1 year of experience operating commercial motor vehicle with a CDL in interstate commerce. So in past, there has been most of the driver selection standards that we just talked about were 2 or more years of experience. So this regulation never really came into play. Now with our driver shortage that's been going on here, we're seeing that now they have to comply to this if they're hiring a driver, CDL licensed driver with less than 1 year experience. So what does the regulation say? If you do that, you have to provide training and documentation in the 4 following areas: driver qualification, hours of service, driver wellness, and whistleblower protection. So we have advocacy groups that follow our industry, and this regulation's been under fire by them for the last 15, 20 years. They're basically saying, what do those 4 areas have to do with a driver's skill in operating a truck safely going down the road? So the FMCSA has gone back and forth with all kind of proposed regulations here, and now they have come out with a final rule. So this final rule establishes minimum training standards for intrastate and interstate drivers applying for their initial CDL, upgrading their current CDL, or obtaining a hazardous materials passenger or school bus endorsement for the first time. So it's more encompassing than the previous rule, because that was interstate only. This is intra and inter, and it includes hazardous materials endorsements, passenger, school bus endorsements for the first time. So what does it say? It says that the prescribed training includes both theory, knowledge, so classroom instruction, and behind the wheel, range and public road instruction. This rule has been delayed. It's been delayed till February 7th of 2022, but it is eventually coming to fruition. It's going to happen. What I see is that the truck driving schools are going to pick this up, because the training has to be certified. Major carriers will provide this training, I think, for new hire drivers that they want to put on, but it's going to happen. So we've got till February 7th of 2022. Let's talk about driver shortage and what's going on with the driver shortage today. So for those of you that have been in the industry for any length of time, our industry, it seems like, has talked about a driver shortage for years. I can remember back in the 90s, early 2000s, everybody complained about a driver shortage. And I always told folks that I've got an answer for the driver shortage, but you don't want to hear it. And that answer we saw came in 2008, 2009. And that's when the economy took a dump and we didn't need as many drivers that were in the industry. And so the driver shortage, driver turnover just kind of all went away. Well, now we're seeing happening is the generations are playing a critical role in driver turnover. So as we look in the future, this driver shortage is going to be with us for a while. Now my only answer to the driver shortage, well, there's two answers now, I guess. That still the economy could take a dump again, but now we have this thing called autonomous driving that's on the horizon. So if we build a truck that doesn't need a driver, then obviously that's going to affect the driver shortage. But we'll see how that all plays out in the future. That's not something in the very near future in my mind. I think it's out there a ways yet. So it'll be interesting how that all evolves. So. All right. So when we start the process, we've got our driver selection and standards in place, and now we need to hire a driver. The first and foremost thing that we do is build a driver qualification file. Driver qualification files by the FMCSA are required for all drivers of motor carriers operating vehicles above 10,000 pounds of gross vehicle weight rating. That's for interstate. So intrastate, you need to check with your intrastate regulations. A number of the states don't require driver qualification files till it's a CDL licensed driver, but you'll have to check with your intrastate regulation. The driver qualification files maintained for each driver for duration of employment 3 years thereafter must include application, copy of certificate of road test, copy of CDL, pre-hire annual MVR, all those things. Also required is pre-hire drug tests, hazmat training, security training if necessary. All those things are part of the driver qualification file. So in addition to that, to protect your liability, additional things are recommended. Certificate of compliance. This is Form 4-10 in our transportation guide to safety and compliance. Driver qualification identification certificate. In today's environment, a lot of companies are doing that, giving their drivers, employee identification badges. As we see security, those kind of things enhanced, that can be an important piece. So what can be removed from a driver qualification file? And I'm a big believer in keeping your files clean, keeping them updated. There's a number of reasons for that. If you get into a safety audit by the FMCSA, DOT compliance audit, you want to make sure that they're looking at just the items that they're required to look at. They're not sorting through a bunch of information. In today's world, I recommend that you keep 3 files for each driver. The DOT driver qualification file, confidential file, that's where anything goes about the health of the driver, anything that's confidential goes in that file, positive drug screens, all that go into that confidential file. And then there's a third file that's an HR file. The HR file gets filled with wage garnishments, Fannie Mae loan applications, whatever, disciplinary action, all that goes into the HR file. So when you're in an intervention or an audit with the FMCSA, you hand them that DOT file and they get a look at the items that are required. Believe me, these officers don't want to sort through all that other stuff. Make it easy for them to complete their job. So what can be removed after out of the files 3 years after the date of execution? Medical certificate in a long form if you've obtained a long form medical. Certificate of violations, annual MVR review, annual MVR physical waiver. You always want to keep the original MVR in the file. Do not remove that. May be removed 3 years after the date of termination, initial MVR at the time of file, driver applications, complete driver qualification file. So by regulation at the time of termination, you need to maintain the driver qualification file for a period of 3 years. The reason for that is the past employment inquiries can go out 3 years. So past employer can contact you if you had hired that driver within the 3-year period. You have to have that information available. Driver qualification file checklist, not required by the FMCSA. I think it's a good tool to use. It ensures consistency and quality in every driver that you qualify. Can be expanded to include company required items. You know, if you issue things to your drivers, load locks, whatever, that can all be documented on that driver qualification file checklist. I don't have a problem with, keeping that. It just, the other thing with that is if there's more than one person doing the orientation of a driver, that allows you to initial to determine who did what piece of the orientation with the driver. So later on, if you have an issue with a certain section of the orientation in that driver, you can go back and see who gave the training. So we're going to start with the driver application. This is where the process really starts. Let's talk about the application itself. Where do you get it? We've got great customers, Office Max, all those Staples, all those folks. But I walk in those stores and I look for applications and I see generic office applications, but I don't see an application as required by the FMCSA, specifically 391.21. You can get these applications obviously from Trans Products, J.J. Keller, maybe even your state trucking association. But it must include carrier's name and address, all employers in the past 3 years, all commercial driving employment in 7 years preceding that previous 3-year period, all accidents, violations of past 3 years, driver's signature and dated, no items left blank. So that's very important that no items on this are left blank. It can be done electronically or on paper, either one, but it is important that it be completed. I recommend that if you're doing it in paper, that the applicant completes it, signs it. If there's any missing information, you hand it right back to the applicant. I recommend that even if you're having a receptionist or somebody like that hand these out to applicants, before that applicant leaves your office, I would recommend that you review that application just to make sure everything is on there as needed. Because this is where the critical, everything's going to start. You need this information to start doing the past employment inquiries, get all that information. So we move on to the road test examination. Required by the FMCSA? Yes? No? Maybe? We'll take a look at this. Obviously, here's the regulation, 391.31, road test examination, Form 4-4. Performance rated on road test form ensures driver applicant can safely operate a commercial motor vehicle. Must include at a minimum 8 specific areas that you're testing the driver. Pre-trip, coupling, uncoupling, placement of CMV in operation, use of CMV controls, emergency equipment, and operation in traffic, passing others, turning, braking, parking the commercial motor vehicle. In today's pandemic world, I've had a lot of questions about road test examinations. How do we do this? So I can tell you that carriers are doing it with a senior driver in the truck, and they have a mask, they have a shield on, they're sitting in the passenger seat, and they administer the road test. I have some customers that are following the driver road testing in the commercial motor vehicle. They're following behind in passenger vehicle, observing what's going on, talking to that driver through hands-free speakerphone, that applicant, telling them exactly what to do when. So it's those are the two ways. We have some customers where we put plexiglass down the middle of the cab. I'm not in favor of that. I think that can cause some distraction to the driver. That sets up a whole lot of interesting things that we may not be aware of, glare, those kind of things that weren't there before. So anyway, that's how in today's pandemic world, some of the carriers are addressing road test examinations. By federal regulation, who can administer road tests? This is interesting. So the FMCSA says that the person administering a road test has to have the knowledge to assess the skills of the driver. That's it. So they're not saying that person even has to be licensed to operate a commercial motor vehicle. All they said is that they have to have the knowledge to assess the skills of the motor vehicle. Now, to protect your liability, I would strongly recommend that the person administering the road test to a new applicant be licensed to operate the vehicle that the applicant is operating in the test examination. For one, for a CDL, that says that they had the knowledge to pass that test to be able to assess that applicant. I'm a big believer in road tests. You can learn a lot from road tests. Drivers will tell you things inside cabs of trucks, but they won't in your office. And I've always said, I don't know if it's the diesel fumes start flowing or vibration, operating the truck, they feel at home, and all of a sudden they're telling you things. The other thing is you get to actually observe how they drive. I've had a lot of discussions with safety directors on road tests that a lot of the safety directors don't feel that they're adequate or justified in giving a road test examination to somebody that has 30, 40 years of experience. Just because they have 30, 40 years of experience doesn't mean they're safe drivers. Okay, they can have bad habits. Okay, so the FMCSA 391.33 does allow a motor carrier to exempt a driver applicant from a road test. There's a number of ways that can happen. You can accept a certificate of road test if completed within the preceding 3 years. As I talk to safety directors and seminars, and I think I've come across one or two safety directors where a driver applicant has presented that road test certificate within the preceding 3 years. I would recommend that you not accept it. I'm a big believer in road tests. Don't accept that. May accept a CDL in lieu of a road test if the road test was completed in similar equipment. Does not apply to double, triple trailer or tank vehicle endorsements. So if you're operating double, triple trailers or tank vehicles, it's mandatory you road test the driver. There's another driver that you have to road test. And a lot of people don't even think about that, but that's a non-CDL driver. Driver operating commercial motor vehicle greater than 10,000 pounds has to be road tested, because unless you accept that certificate of road test, the first one, which hardly anyone even has, then they don't have a CDL for you to accept and exempt the road test. They're a non-CDL driver. So that's telling you that all non-CDL drivers have to be road tested by regulation. So the certificate of road test, you can give that to the driver at the end of the road test. Must include a minimum operation traffic passing, all those things we talked about, and the certificate is documented. And like I said, if the driver leaves your employ, takes it to someone else, he could present it. If the road test was done within the previous 3 years, I wouldn't recommend it though, accepting that. So let's move on to the driver motor vehicle record. So as now we've got a application completed, we've road tested the driver, and now we're serious about hiring this driver. It's interesting if we take a look at purely the federal regulations, motor vehicle records, past employment inquiries, those type of things by regulation have to be completed within 30 days of the application date. In today's environment, to protect your liability, we're not going to do that. We're going to take a look at this motor vehicle record before we even make an offer of employment to the driver. But I need to let you know what the regulation is. That's the regulation. Obtained annually thereafter. CDLIS MVR. So this came into effect back in January 30th, 2015. So when the driver updates, CDL driver updates their medical certification, that information is placed on the motor vehicle record of the driver, and the motor carrier, must have a copy of that new motor vehicle record within 15 days of medical certification. That went into effect July 30th, 2015. There was regulation in place where we were going to take the driver out of that. It's been pushed down the road here. We were going to take the driver out of the middle of this thing because right now the driver gets medical certification, goes to the DMV, submits that. It was proposed that the medical examiner would upload all medical certifications by midnight of the following business day to the FMCSA. The FMCSA would then download it to the state driver licensing departments, and then we wouldn't have to worry about this. But that got pushed down the road because the states couldn't get their computer programming together, so that's still delayed. Past employment inquiries. So who's required to complete a past, what's required? There's basically 3 types of inquiries that are required. Past employer reference checks, drug and alcohol inquiries for CDL drivers, and then accident history. So we're going to take a look at each of those. All right. So we'll start off with the inquiry, the authorization inquiry, written authorization from applicant to conduct drug and alcohol inquiries. You need to maintain that in a secure location. Controlled access, retained for duration of employment in 3 years thereafter. Okay. Accident inquiries, we go back 3 years as well. This is DOT recordable accidents only. Any other accidents at the discretion of the employer. So how do we contact these past employers? How does this work, right? So there's a number of ways that you can do this. You can hire an outside service to do this, a third party. There are a number of them out there that can do that. Obviously, years ago, it was telephone and mail, right? Well, now we've moved into email. It was fax for a while. Hardly anybody uses faxes anymore, so it's email, okay? You can use email. I still like using a written letter if my efforts fail. I then send a letter. A lot of times that'll tell me a lot about the company too. Is it still in business? If the letter is delivered, you don't hear anything back, that they're still in business, right? So I tell folks the FMCSA, where they're at on past employment inquiries, is make a reasonable attempt, is basically that's what the regulation says. To protect your liability, I would recommend that you make 3 attempts using different types of inquiries, right? Like telephone, email, and, maybe written, third party, whatever. Okay. But before you stop that inquiry, you use 3 different methods to obtain information. Document, document, document. Document even when you do not receive information. If you called somebody and the phone's disconnected, type up, print out a Word doc that says you contacted this past employer on this date, this phone number, the phone is disconnected, date it, sign it, put it in the file. All right? Create your own documentation to protect your liability. So the drug and alcohol inquiry, this has to go to all DOT regulated employment in the previous 3 years. So if that applicant was operating a CDL vehicle or a non-CDL that was subject to the drug and alcohol testing regulations, or hauling hazardous materials, anything like that, passengers, whatever, that would have required a CDL license, then you have to make an inquiry into that past employer. It's completed within 30 days of a safety sensitive function. There's basically 3 questions that have to be answered. Was there a positive drug test? Was there an alcohol test with the results of 0.04 or greater, or a refusal to test? A lot of the larger carriers today, I know, are charging folks for past employment. They'll refer you to a website that you have to sign up for and pay money, and then you get the information. The FMCSA is very clear that drug and alcohol inquiry information cannot be withheld from an employer by a past employer for payment of funds. Okay. So if you've got somebody that's withholding that information because you're not paying them for it, let the FMCSA know. They will take care of that. All right. All right. So with the drug and alcohol inquiry now, we're involving this year into the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. So the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse regulation went into effect January 6, 2020, and it applies to CDL licensed drivers only. The other thing I would tell you is it only applies to the tests that are required by the FMCSA. I've had a lot of questions on this because a lot of you have your own drug and alcohol testing that you administer to drivers in addition to the federal regulations. The clearinghouse is very specific. It only addresses the tests that are required by the FMCSA. So why the clearinghouse? Well, first of all, there was about 7 states that had their own clearinghouses. And when you see the states start doing things on their own, it's all over the board, right? States don't do anything that matches another state. They just do it on their own. So we had drug and alcohol clearinghouses from one end of the spectrum for school bus endorsement drivers, CDL drivers only, to the other end of the spectrum where all CDL drivers, and if you had a positive test, you lost your CDL. So it was all over the board. So the feds grabbed a hold of this. I'm a big proponent of the clearinghouse. Here's why. There are a lot of drivers today that tested positive that went to carriers that did not do past drug and alcohol inquiries and are driving commercial motor vehicles today. That number is estimated that there's 80 to 100,000 drivers operating commercial motor vehicles today that have had positive tests that did not go through the recertification process to be qualified again. So the clearinghouse will now mandate that you report to them all positive tests and refusals to test, and that you query a driver, applicant, prior to employment to put them on using the clearinghouse to make sure that they don't have an outstanding violation of drug and alcohol regulations. All right. So this went into effect January 6, 2020. Mandatory use of the clearinghouse to report and query information about driver drug and alcohol program violation goes into effect. January 23rd, 2023, employers must query the clearinghouse to satisfy employer requirement to identify prospective drivers who committed drug and alcohol program violations. So what's going to happen in 2023, what that means is that when they have 3 years of information, we're going to see the drug and alcohol inquiry that you're currently doing to past employers go away, because now they'll have 3 years worth of information. So the cost of a query is $1.25 per query, but it can be purchased from the FMCSA in bundles. So the website for the clearinghouse provides you with a lot of information. There's the website on the screen. There's a lot of information, FAQs, all that information is there. That clearinghouse is a secure online database that will allow FMCSA, CMV employers, state driver license agencies, and law enforcement to identify in real time CDL drivers who have violated federal drug and alcohol testing program requirements. So that's basically what it's doing. It's allowing us to see those drivers, and medical examiners as well can report up. I had a lot of people go, why is a motor carrier required to report? Well, there's one positive that a medical examiner is not aware of, and that's a refusal. All right. So when a CDL licensed driver refuses to take a drug and alcohol test, administered test, that's in the eyes of the FMCSA, that's a positive test. So that's another reason why you, the motor carrier, have to report. So as we look at the queries that you're required to do, there's 2 types of queries. There's the full query, and that is before hiring a new driver, all motor carriers must complete a full query of the drug and alcohol clearinghouse to see if the driver is eligible for hire. So if you're sitting right here now, 7, 8 months down the road, 8 months down the road, and you're saying, oh boy, I haven't done this. You're not in violation if you haven't hired a driver, okay? A CDL licensed driver. So if you're a small carrier and you haven't hired a driver, then you're fine. You can get registered yet, all right? The only time you're going to be in violation is if you hire a driver after January 6th and you didn't complete the query, okay? So a full query discloses to employers and designated TPAs detailed information about any resolved or unresolved violations in the driver's record. And then there's the limited query. So in addition to that, querying the clearinghouse when you hire an applicant, you must conduct a limited query of all CDL licensed drivers to determine if they have prohibited from operating a CMV due to drug and alcohol violations. This query must be conducted by you, the motor carrier, as part of, and that is to be done annually, okay? So that limited query is done annually. the reason for that is that if you have drivers that are working at multiple carriers, right, and they test positive at one, but they don't tell you, they keep working, then you're not going to be aware that they violated the drug and alcohol regulations. So those are the two different type of queries that are to be required, that are required for the clearinghouse. So hopefully you're all on board with this. There was a lot of information put out in the industry as well as the FMCSA, and it's a good thing. We need to get those 80 and 100,000 drivers off the road that are operating that tested positive and didn't go through the recertification process. All right, the next slide is we're going to talk about another pre-employment screening program. It's called the PSP, Pre-Employment Screening Program. This has been around for, probably 10 years at least. It's a great program. I have to tell you, it is voluntary. It's not required by the FMCSA. The FMCSA outsources their MICMAS data, Motor Carrier Management Information System data, to a third party, and that third party administers these inquiries that you can do as a motor carrier on a driver applicant. So what does it provide you? 5 years of crash data and 3 years of inspection data. There is a cost to this. It's $100 per year for carriers with greater than 100 units, $25 for carriers with less than 100 units, and it's $10 fee per search. So the question that people ask is, so what can I see on this that I can't see on a motor vehicle record? So you go back on that 5 years of crash data and 3 years of inspection data, they tell you who the employer was for those events. So right away you can take that information, cross-reference it with the application, where the applicant tells you where he's been, who he's been employed within the previous 3 years or additional 7 years of operating commercial motor vehicle. So there is an annual subscription cost, like I said, but if I'm a small carrier and I only use it once, for $35 it prevents me from hiring a bad driver. That's a pretty good deal. Okay. There are violations that you'll see on the inspection data that you're not going to see on the MBR. And hours of service is one, medical certifications, expired would be another one. There are certain violations you're going to see in PSP that you're not going to see on a DM or a motor vehicle record. So, I've seen where the motor vehicle record is clean, but then I go look at the PSP, and every time this driver gets into a roadside inspection, he's got an hours of service violation. So it can show you a little bit more about a driver and what's going on, and then cross-reference with that application for accuracy. Now we move on to the physical qualification for drivers. So who's subject to being physically qualified to operate a commercial motor vehicle? Person subject to this part must not operate a commercial motor vehicle unless he or she is medically certified, is physically qualified to do so. So 10,000, 1 or more pounds, greater than 10,000, interstate commerce, commercial motor vehicle, you're required to have a medical certification. When passing a DOT medical examination, the driver is good for 2 years. So there are medical conditions that could restrict the length of the medical certification to as little as 3 months. You need to pay special attention to this. If you've got a driver that comes back from a medical exam and hands you the certification and it's only good for 3 months or 6 months, you need to understand what's going on, or a year, right? Each one of those. Hypertension, blood pressure, obviously there's 3 different stages of that that plays into this. The one thing with a 3-month certificate, it is only good once. If you see a doctor that keeps sending your driver back, keeps extending his medical certification by 3 months, the doctor doesn't understand the regulation. Okay. So long form physicals, you know, in the past, they were pretty important. I always told people it's, you know, the responsibility for qualifying, putting a medically qualified driver in a truck is a responsibility of the motor carrier, not the medical examiner. So for that reason, I always wanted to see the long form physical. In today's world, with the changes the FMCSA has made to the medical examiners with training and certification, all that going on, I don't know that the long form physical is as important as it used to be. Our society has evolved to protecting the privacy of especially medical information of citizens. So long form physical, if I was obtaining that today, I would have a HIPAA release signed by my driver. Okay. Diabetes exemption. This is another one that has evolved. It used to be that the FMCSA required that you got a waiver. Not anymore. Your personal physician and the qualifying medical examiner can now certify a driver with insulin-treated diabetes, and the waiver is no longer required. It is a 1-year certification. Medical certificate. When that medical exam is completed, a medical certificate is provided by the physician, given to the driver to provide to their state DMV. Copy given to motor carrier employing driver. You need to keep a copy of that. CDL licensed drivers are not required to carry their medical certification on their person for more than 15 days after date of issuance as valid proof of medical certification. The reason for that is now that information is on their DMV record or the MVR record, which law enforcement has access to so they can see it. All right. Some of the drivers still carry them. That's fine. It's not required. It is required, however, for non-CDL drivers because there is no integration of medical certification and driver's licenses for non-CDL drivers. So non-CDL drivers are required to keep their medical certification on their person. So I get this question all the time. My truck's over 10,000, less than 26. Not a CDL driver. They're crossing state lines. Do they need a medical certification? And the answer is absolutely yes. Okay, medical examiner certification. I alluded to this earlier. This went on about 5 years ago. All drivers' medical certification for CDL and non-CDL now must be completed by a medical examiner in the FMCSA registry. There's the link to the registry. You can go in there, put in the zip code, and see the medical examiners that are in your zip code that can provide your drivers with a medical examination. You, as the motor carrier, are required to verify that the medical examiner is in the registry. This is a crazy regulation. It's there. The only thing I can tell you is when you're in there taking a look for medical examiners, or you have a driver that come back with a medical examiner certification, you go into the registry and you just take a screenshot and put it in the driver qualification file. Medical examiner certification integration rule, and this is what I talked about earlier. when we were talking about MVRs. The implementation date for medical examiner integration final rule has been officially delayed for 3 years. Compliance date originally slated for June 22nd of 18 has now been rescheduled for June 22nd of 2021. And this is where the medical examiner's information would go into the FMCSA and then back down to the state driver's licensing agency system, taking the driver out of the middle of this. So it's no longer, it's going to happen, but it's not going to happen until next year. Sleep apnea. This has been one that the industry has wrestled with for, at least 10 years, if not longer. So it was interesting back in 2014, there was proposed guidance by the FMCSA to the medical examiners regarding sleep apnea. And this had to do with neck size and body mass index, and a whole bunch of things. And so the American Trucking Association, a number of associations, posed that guidance by the FMCSA. And they said, if you're going to do guidance, we want regulation. And rightfully so, because when the FMCSA or any government entity establishes a new regulation, they have to determine what the economic impact is to the industry that this addresses. And the associations knew this was going to be a huge economic impact with sleep apnea. So they backed off of that. And at the same time, as we just saw on a previous slide, they were doing the registry for and training and certification of medical examiners. And so what I saw went on was that as I talked to customers and drivers, I saw that switch from certified medical examiners, they starting asking specific questions regarding sleep apnea, specifically 3 questions. You know, do you sleep continuously through the night? Do you snore? And do you fall asleep watching television? And basically, if the answer was yes to any of those, or the first one, no, I don't sleep continuously through the night, then they would submit them for sleep apnea testing. So as we look at this whole thing of sleep apnea, we've always had a regulation in place, 391.41 subpart B, subpart 5, that says basically that you cannot have an established medical history or clinical diagnosis of respiratory dysfunction likely to interfere with the ability to control and drive a commercial motor vehicle without being, addressed. And so the FMCSA has now pretty well backed off of this and said, this is between you and your medical examiner. All right. 20%, it's estimated 20% of drivers afflicted with sleep apnea. So, as a motor carrier, you can't bury your head in the sand on sleep apnea. You've got to address this, talk to your health insurance companies, and, work out a program to take care of your drivers. Moving on, certification of violation annual review. This is for interstate carriers. Every 12 months, your driver has to complete a list of traffic violations other than parking violations. And then you, the motor carrier, has to do an annual review. And that basically says that this driver complies with the federal regulations. And then another form that's in the driver qualification file, could be in there, is a driver violation notification. and that is a form that the driver is required to notify employer within 30 days after conviction. Now, here's that's the regulation, right? 30 days after conviction. That doesn't say arrest. That doesn't say citation. So how do you protect yourself as a motor carrier? You need to have in your own company policy and procedures a policy that says, driver, if you were warned, cited, arrested, convicted, whatever, immediately you need to notify your supervisor, okay? So you don't want the driver to comply with the regulation. You want them to comply with your own company policies and procedures to protect your liability. You want to know that your driver was arrested for a DUI. Just because they're not convicted doesn't mean that can impact your liability exposure. Okay. So as we talk about all the driver qualification file, a thing that comes into play is electronic signatures. As I stated before, you can complete all the documents electronically, applications, all that, DQ files, all can be done electronically today. The only time that the FMCSA will not allow electronic signatures is if you get into an audit or an intervention involved, and you have to file those documents directly with the FMCSA. They need to be wet signed. One other topic that I want to address here before we get into the best practices for driver qualification files is cell phone policy in the CMV. As I go through CSA and I take a look at customers and I look at the violations, I still see a lot of cell phone violations. All right. Back in 2012, cell phone use in a commercial motor vehicle is limited to hands-free device only. Final rule prohibits commercial drivers in interstate commerce from using a handheld mobile phone while operating a commercial truck. Push-to-talk cell phones or radios are prohibited. Ironically, CBs are still okay, and the penalties can range up to $2,700 or $2,750 for drivers and up to $11,000 for employers who allow or require their drivers to use handheld communication devices. So our society has placed a lot of emphasis on distracted driving due to the amount of fatalities and injury accidents, physical damage accidents that have occurred through distracted driving. So let's take a look at some best practices concerning driver qualification. Follow the federal requirements for intrastate. Some states exempt file requirements under 26,000. Like I said earlier, if you always follow the federal requirements, you're going to cover up the states because the states have to meet the minimum requirements of the FMCSA. May include technicians, sales personnel, dispatchers, owners. Written selection standards, including minimum age, experience, maximum allowable tickets, accidents, violation. The one thing I'll say about that driver selection standard is if you have to make a change to that standard, say you were at 3 years of experience, now you're going to drop it to 2. Change the standard. Last thing you want is a driver involved in an accident that does not meet your current selection standards. Okay. So as long as it meets the minimum requirements of the FMCSA and your insurance carrier is okay with it, then go ahead and drop it, but make sure you change the standards. Like I said earlier, road test all drivers. I'm a big believer in road testing drivers. I think you can defend yourself in a liability situation better by saying that here's a road test document that the driver was road tested in these 8 specific areas, instead of holding up their CDL license that says I used this and exempted the road test. Do not accept a medical certification from a driver applicant. We didn't talk about that, but the federal regulations do allow that. If you driver applicant submits you a medical certification that has not expired, you can accept that. I would not recommend that. I would recommend that all medical certifications go through a doctor that you have a relationship with on the registry. And then exhaust 3 different methods of obtaining a past employment inquiry before stopping, again, to protect your liability. So as you can see, the driver qualification process is where it all starts. It's very important that you take your time and do it correctly and make sure it's documented properly and in the file. Okay. Unfortunately, if you end up in an accident or some other reason where you get into litigation concerning your driver, the driver qualification file will be the first thing that's going to be subpoenaed. And I can tell you that in an accident situation or any other situation involving your driver, that file is frozen. And what I mean by that is you can't take anything out of it, put anything in it, fix something that was incorrect. Because what happens as a custodian of that file, when this eventually gets into court, first thing that plaintiff's attorney is going to ask you, have you altered, changed, added anything to this file from the date and time of the accident? Now you got 2 choices. One is tell the truth. Second one's not good. That's perjure yourself. So you don't want to do that. So you want to make sure that the file meets all the federal regulation requirements. Everything's in there. It's completed. Everything's ready to go when you put that driver into service for the first time.
Now that we have concluded the webinar, I would ask that if you have any questions about the material we have covered today, that you please email me. Our next webinar in the series will be on September 9th, and we will address keeping your driver safe during a pandemic. I will leave up my contact information for you to email questions that you may have. The registration link will also be there for you to register for a future webinar. Thanks again for attending the webinar. Stay safe and take care.